One of the more interesting build-ups for the next Fallout game is thinking about where it might possibly take place. And while we're not likely to get a new single-player Fallout game for the next, 14 or so years, it can still be a bit of fun thinking about it. Where will Fallout 5 take place? Now, before we get too deep into the video, I do want to say I have no insider knowledge or am even saying something is absolutely certain. I speculate just like any other fan, and while I may have my theories or good hunches, as it were, I can still be absolutely wrong. Something I notice about Bethesda's style is they like to give hints about future titles by mentioning the locations or events in their works. There's a few examples in Elder Scrolls, but I think the most obvious one actually comes from Redguard, where we see a lot of titles lined up nicely. Arena to Oblivion. They actually go up to Elder Scrolls 5, though Skyrim replaced the Romanelli. I don't know. It sounds like it was meant to be the Imperial-focused title originally. And, of course, the best Fallout example would be in Fallout 3, where they introduced Synths, or Android as it was in Fallout 3, the Commonwealth, the Institute, and even the Railroad.
We call ourselves the Railroad. Our mission is the rescue and salvation of synthetic humanoids. Androids, as they're more commonly known.
All very interesting stuff. I suppose the biggest qualifier would actually be mentions, though a lot of places do get mention in some capacity. So given I have no real evidence, I think I'm going to look at it from a fairly arbitrary view. That is, the setting was mentioned with some importance in a past title, may have known developer input in some form, and just has a personal gut feeling to me. In that regard, I feel like these are the possible ones: New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. New York has been mentioned dozens of times in Fallout. It's the single most well-known city in the United States. It was one of the considerations for Fallout 4. Emil even produced a design document with the idea in mind. And honestly, that city just makes the most sense for a future Fallout East Coast game. Chicago is pretty interesting. It was mentioned quite a lot throughout various titles. EDE or Eddie even passed through it, with Tactus no longer being fully canon, but there still being a definite Midwest chapter of the Brotherhood in Chicago.
There's also a small detachment in Chicago, but they're off the radar. Gone rogue. Long story.
There's material to work with already. We may even learn more about what is canon from Tactics and what's new. Los Angeles is probably the weakest of the more probable titles. The LA Boneyard is very well known with a lot of lore attached to it, being one of the more important states in the NCR. Still, it also gets a number of mentions, though most of that is from New Vegas. 4 and 76 do have mentions of Los Angeles, but nothing too significant. Regardless, there's a lot to play with in the broader sense of LA itself. Post-war Hollywood never really got touched upon. It'll be interesting to see. However, given the Boneyard is so significant to the lore, it may stay only physically shown in the original Fallout. That brings me to San Francisco, and this is the one I feel like it's going to be. So here's my biggest reason why I believe it's going to be San Francisco. While New York City had a number of mentions, more across the various titles, none of them really stood out to me, not in the same way that San Francisco did. Of course, there's the Atomic Command game, where San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge was shown with a number of other landmarks, including New York City's Statue of Liberty, as well as landmarks for DC, the National Mall, Boston, the Custom House Tower, and, very interesting, welcome to the fabulous New Vegas sign. Then there's Kellogg. We got to know his background story pretty well. He smokes the San Francisco Sunlight cigars, a rather important quest item.
And cigars. San Francisco Sunlights.
Interesting brand. Won't lead us anywhere on its own.
And while from the hub, he worked in San Francisco. We even see the Golden Gate Bridge in his memory.
I thought San Francisco was my chance to start fresh. I was the hot shit, the gunslinger from the hub, rolling into town with the world at my feet.
And it worked with a she.
And you don't need to worry about me. Most of it's just running security for the she. A lot of standing around looking tough.
The she being an important faction in Fallout 2. They rule over San Francisco's Chinatown, are descendants of a Chinese submarine crew, and are quite technologically advanced. Lately, it kinda seems like Bethesda has been having a bit of a crush on the she. Not only mentioned in Fallout 4, but even 76. There was a missile launcher skin released for the she in Nuclear Winter. But it doesn't really stop there. In Fallout 2, the main enemies of the she were the Hubologists, a religious group that not so subtly parodied Scientology. They were rather cunning and devious, if notably crazy, having a pretty strong influence in San Francisco, though of little importance outside of it. And what's more, Fallout 4 brought back the Hubologists in Nuka World.
Welcome, stranger. We are hubologists. You may have heard of us. No? Oh, well.
While they're not the same as the San Francisco branch, being less cunning and a lot more comical, it's still nice to see them back. Of course, there's a little more than just mentions, references, and a faction appearance. Not only was New York City considered for Fallout 4, but so was San Francisco. And originally, Obsidian was going to follow a little bit of their Van Buren design document and have San Francisco wiped off the map. Bethesda stopped them, wanting San Francisco to be an option for future games. There's a couple of reasons why it's not likely to be San Francisco. The biggest one is that Bethesda is simply an East Coast company. I vaguely recall an article where members of Bethesda, maybe Todd Howard, were saying that Obsidian were West Coast people and Bethesda were East Coast people, but for the life of me, I can't seem to find it no matter how much I Google. Honestly, it seems other people are in the same situation. They can remember it, but they can't seem to find it. Feels like a Mandela effect. Then there's the fact that San Francisco was in Fallout 2, much like LA was in Fallout 1. For some, these are disqualifiers in themselves. This is an idea that, while I understand, I don't personally put much stock in. These cities really only had a very tiny sliver of them presented in the classic Fallout games. There's a whole lot more that you can explore in a 3D environment. The final reason is just the fact that there's a lot of lore in LA and San Francisco already, more so LA. And while true, it doesn't exactly mean they can't develop on or add new lore to the already established ones. Truthfully, the fact that San Francisco was a consideration for Fallout 4 does honestly feel like it nullifies these arguments. They're East Coast people? Sure, but they were open to San Francisco. San Francisco was in an old game already? Sure, but they didn't seem to care that much about it. There's a lot of lore in San Francisco? Sure, but they probably had ideas to build on it. It might be San Francisco, it might not be. My gut feeling is telling me it will be, but my gut has been wrong before. If it's not San Francisco, it's probably going to be New York City. If it is San Francisco, it's likely going to play more heavily into the She versus Hubology storyline, and I expect there to be a fair bit of involvement with the NCR in some form. Possible annexation attempts, with a lot of She being against it. It would fit the NCR MO. You know, a San Francisco game could actually allow for some neat DLC that takes place in the environments of the early games. Fallout 5, the Hub DLC, where we can get a good look at the hub in a large 3D environment. Honestly, would be pretty cool. So what do you think? Where will Fallout 5 take place? For that matter, what will your dream Fallout 5 location be? What about your dream game? I decided to set up a survey that's purely lighthearted and fun. Basically, you telling me your dream Fallout title. Every question is optional. Every question has an other category. And there's a few open response questions too. You could tell me your gameplay and your plot ideas. You may also, and again, this is optional, but you may be able to put down your online handle if you want. I plan to read or at least summarize a few of these ideas in a future video. If you want me to credit you for it, go for it. And when you're done, check out a few of my other videos too. See you later.